Madam President, let me say while the senator from West Virginia, the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, is here, that notwithstanding the fact that the original Biden bill had all these elements in it, the truth of the matter is we would not be at this point were it not for the leadership and innovation shown by the senator from West Virginia. This notion of a crime-fighting trust fund to make happen what we all say in this floor, to use the vernacular to put our money where our mouth is truly innovative, and I would argue will be the essence of why this legislation takes hold to make society a little safer and a little better. And it is my hope and expectation that our colleagues in the House of Representatives, when we get to a conference with them, will understand that this is not a negotiable point on the part of the Senate conferees. I'm looking forward to this bill passing, but I'm also looking forward to there being an absolutely united front among every member of the conference, Democrat and Republican on the Senate side, to keep in the Robert C. Byrd idea of a trust fund. Because otherwise, all we're doing is making a lot of promises and not having any realistic prospect of being able to fulfill them. So I want to compliment the senator from West Virginia for his significant contribution. I said earlier, at the time we passed the trust fund notion as an amendment in this bill, that every time we've wanted to get, I've been here almost 20 years now, not nearly as long as my friend from West Virginia, but every time there's been a tough problem to solve, and every time I've needed assistance for something to get a difficult amendment passed or a new idea moved, the fellow I've always gone to is the distinguished senator from West Virginia. I know of no one who is more effective in the Senate. I know of no one who is more consistent, and I know of no one who sticks to a commitment more than the senator from West Virginia does. So I must tell you, I feel somewhat emboldened going to the House, God willing, when we pass this conference report, knowing that everyone in the House also knows that the senator from West Virginia is very committed to this notion of a trust fund.
Madam President, will the senator yield?
I'll be polite.
Madam President, I thank the senator for his gracious remarks. I thank him, however, mostly for his leadership on this bill and for his strong support of having 100,000 policemen on the streets throughout this country. I also thank him for his assurance that the conferees will hold firm with respect to the authorization of $22 billion and with respect to the trust fund. I don't like to go in that direction. I haven't approached any matter in that way thus far and may never again, but I felt that it was important that this bill be funded so that the American people would really be able to gain hope from the actions taken in the Senate. Again, thank him for his leadership, and I thank
Madam President, I have found in my experience when the senator from West Virginia thinks something is very important, the Senate tends to think it's important, and I'm confident the House will as well. So it's always only on, I think, 3 occasions in my career on a critical matter have I been on the other side of the issue from the senator from West Virginia, and in retrospect, I've regretted all 3. But I yield to my colleague.
Madam President.
Senator from Utah. Senator from Delaware.
Madam President, I yield myself 3 minutes. Madam President, it's been a real pleasure to work with my friend from Texas. We most times are on opposite sides of issues. This time we're on the same side. But it is, I realize in this business, it's difficult for us to, notwithstanding the fact we're personally cooperating on this bill, for us to dismiss the prospect of some partisanship. Let me set the record straight. on this bill. The underlying bill, which is now the Biden-Hatch bill, was the Biden bill. A guy named Biden wrote that bill, and he wrote that bill by going down and sitting down with the President of the United States of America, not with his Attorney General, not with anyone else, with Bill Clinton, President of the United States of America, who between the time he got elected in November until the time he was sworn in, called me at my home on 6 separate occasions. And he unfortunately doesn't need a lot of sleep. Sometimes literally, and I say this on the record, as late as 11:30 at night, to discuss why I wasn't moving quicker on the Biden crime bill from before. I sat with him, not with his Attorney General. He wanted 100,000 policemen. He does not view this as a social issue as opposed to trying to bring peace and security to the streets. As governor of the state of Arkansas, he presided over, as governor, the execution of individuals within the state and the death penalty. He supports the death penalty. He is the fellow who insisted that I bump this up from initially to when I said, where are we going to get the money? He said, well, all I know is I want 100,000 cops. I made that commitment. He had endorsed the Biden crime bill as a candidate when he ran. He is the one who talks about the need for stiffer penalties. So notwithstanding the fact some of the old Democrats and former presidents who were Democrats before Carter, I suspect, I don't know who we're talking about here, but in the old days, it is true. When Richard Nixon was running for president, Richard Nixon used to talk about law and order, and the Democratic response was law and order with justice, whatever either one of those meant. I never knew. I was running then in 1972. I didn't think Richard Nixon knew what it meant, and I didn't think the opposition knew what it meant. This president is very, very straightforward and simple. He knows there are 2 basic steps here. One step is you must take back the streets. And you take back the streets by more cops, more prisons, more physical protection for the people. He also understands what my friend from Texas understands, and he doesn't talk a lot about, but he signed on to in this bill. He also understands there's a need to keep people who are first-time offenders, who are nonviolent offenders, or who are potential first-time offenders who haven't gotten, I yield myself an additional 3 minutes, who in fact are people who are getting themselves into the crime stream for the first time, that they should be diverted from the system. So I hope this crime bill, when it passes, the Biden-Hatch crime bill, as it becomes law, God willing, I hope that we will have ended once and for all this notion that is a hangover from the 60s, that somehow Democrats are weak on crime and Democratic presidents are weak on crime and Republicans are tough on crime. The truth is, every major crime bill since 1976 that's come out of this Congress, every minor crime bill has had the name of the Democratic senator from the state of Delaware, Joe Biden, on that bill, and has had a majority vote of the Democratic members of the United States Senate on the bill. So one of the things I want to do in addition to end the crime is end the political carnage that goes on when we talk about crime. Crime is not Democrat or Republican. Making the streets safe is not a Democratic or Republican issue. This is one of those issues I hope this passage of this bill will be taken out of the gridlock category and moved into an emerging consensus. And the consensus is as follows, and I will cease when I finish this statement. The consensus is A, we must take back the streets. It doesn't matter whether or not the person that is accosting your son or daughter or my son or daughter, my wife, your husband, my mother, your parents. It doesn't matter whether or not they were deprived as a youth. It doesn't matter whether or not they had no background that enabled them to become socialized into the fabric of society. It doesn't matter whether or not they're the victims of society. The end result is they're about to knock my mother on the head with a lead pipe, shoot my sister, beat up my wife, take on my sons. So I don't want to ask what made them do this. They must be taken off the street. That's number one. There's a consensus on that. The Democratic chairman of the Judiciary Committee, the Democratic president of the United States of America, the Democratic attorney general, the Republican leader of this effort, Senator Hatch, the Republican senator from Texas. We all agree on that. Now, we can find some fringe folks in the study groups on the right wing and left wing, libertarians and left-wingers in my party who say, no, that's not what we should do. But politically, that consensus has been arrived at. I acknowledge there was not that consensus in the 60s. There is today. There's a second thing that we all have agreed upon, and that is unless we do something about that cadre of young people, tens of thousands of them, born out of wedlock, without parents, without supervision, without any structure, without any conscience developing, because they literally, I yield myself 3 more minutes, because they literally have not been socialized. They literally have not had an opportunity. We should focus on them now, not out of a liberal instinct for love, brother, and humanity, although I think that's a good instinct, but for simple pragmatic reasons. If we don't, they will, or a portion of them will, become the predators 15 years from now. And Madam President, we have predators on our streets that society has, in fact, in part because of its neglect, created. Again, it does not mean because we created them that we somehow forgive them or do not take them out of society to protect my family and yours from them. They are beyond the pale, many of those people. Beyond the pale. And it's a sad commentary on society. We have no choice but to take them out of society. And the truth is, we don't very well know how to rehabilitate them at that point. That's the sad truth. You're looking at the fellow who was one of the primary architects of the Sentencing Commission. You know what the basic premise of the Sentencing Commission is? I know the presiding officer knows. It was the first time in 80 years we rejected the notion that the condition of sentencing must be related to how long it would take to rehabilitate. I'm the guy that said rehabilitation, when it occurs, we don't understand it and notice it, and even when we notice it and we know it occurs, we don't know why. So you cannot make rehabilitation a condition for release. That's why in our system, there's the federal system, you serve 85% of your time. I remember when it was going on, when I was making these arguments in the late 70s, they used to call it Biden's same time for the same crime provision. It's a shame, but we don't know how to rehabilitate. But there is a consensus, and I will cease. A, we must make the streets safer. I don't care why someone is a malefactor in society. I don't care why someone is antisocial. I don't care why they become a sociopath. We have an obligation to cordon them off from the rest of society, try to help them, try to change their behavior. That's why we do in this bill. We have drug treatment and we have other treatments to try to deal with it. But they are in jail, away from my mother, your husband, our families. But we would be absolutely stupid as a society if we didn't recognize the condition that nurtured those folks still exist, and we must deal with that. And I think there's a consensus among Republicans in that. Old barbed wire Republican conservatives just want to hang them high. Even those folks are saying, hey, we got to deal with the root cause of this. Not one or the other, but separately. And liberal Democrats who used to say, let's look at the sociological underpinnings of why this occurred, and we have to, they're now saying, hey, look, we got to take back the streets. We'll make that fight later. So there is a consensus. I hope the remainder of the discussion, as we close out the debate in this bill, we can end that old fight. We can put it behind us. Hopefully we have, the senator from West Virginia said this is a historic moment on this bill, a consensus being reached. I think it is, but I think it's a historic moment for a political reason as well. Hopefully we will end the discussion about whether or not Republicans are Neanderthal and only want to hang them high, and Democrats are wacko liberals and only want to look at the causes. Those days are gone. Evidence of that the Democratic senator from Delaware and the Republican conservative senator from Utah are united in a Biden-Hatch crime bill that does all the things that I just said. So as one of my relatives who remain nameless would say, God willing and the creek not rising, hopefully we'll end this kind of debate and decide how we're going to deal with the problem from here on. I reserve the balance of my time.
Senator reserves the balance of his time. Senator has 21 minutes remaining. Who yields time?
President, I yield myself an additional minute. I would like to put into the record the endorsement letters from the 6 major police organizations, the Fraternal Order of Police, the National Association of Police Organizations, the International Brotherhood of Police Officers, International Association of Chiefs of Police, the National Sheriff's Association, National Troopers Coalition, and Delaware State Troopers Association, National Organization for Victims Assistance, National Victims Center, National Association for Crime Compensation Boards, and National Association of State Alcohol and Drug Abuse Directors, Incorporated. I would like to say, we would not have this bill. I've worked for 5 years in this bill with the police of this nation. Every one of those police organizations I've spoken about, their leaders have sat in my office, in my conference room, in my inner office for literally, if you add it all up, several hundred hours. We would not be here were it not for the police helping fashion this bill. And I want to pay public tribute to them now, and I would ask that the letters associated with each of the organizations I listed be entered in the record.
Without objection, they will be so included.
Madam President, I suggest the absence of quorum.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Senator from Delaware.
Request that I'm going to suggest the absence of a quorum and that the time be equally divided between the proponents and opponents.
Without objection.
Be between the managers, I should say. I absence of quorum on those conditions.
Clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Akaka.
Is recognized.
President, I yield myself such time as I may need. Madam President, during the debate, I don't know how many days ago, on this legislation, I made a statement based on a statistic that was given to me in a hearing that more school teachers were killed in the line of duty than police were killed in the line of duty. I'd like to correct that statement. I have had my staff working with the Bureau of Justice Statistics, with the various agencies that maintain and compile these statistics. The number of policemen killed in the line of duty in 1991 was either 69 or 71, depending on which figure you accept. And they were all obviously tragic losses. Between the years 1986 and 1990, 71 teachers and students were killed in school or on school grounds, and 201 students or teachers were severely wounded, and 242 teachers or students were held hostage. I am going to have, for the record, a much more detailed analysis of the exact breakdown, but the point is still the same. Teaching school today is a highly dangerous profession. The notion that you would even be able to compare the risk that police officers faced in their line of duty and that a school teacher or a student faced in the line of their duty of being a student or a teacher 30 years ago would have been preposterous. But the point is that it is not preposterous today, and it is getting worse. It is getting worse for school teachers. It is getting worse for students, as we all know from just watching the television. I will, at the appropriate point, place in the record, and I'm not prepared to do it at this moment, the various statistics, including testimony before the Judiciary Committee relative to the concern of when I held a hearing on congressional in my Judiciary Committee on the issue of guns in schools, and the testimony of Ronald D. Stevens, Executive Director of the National School Safety Center. So I will, because a number of people have asked me, they thought that was a startling figure. It startled me, that's why I mentioned it. And it may turn out not to be precisely as indicated, not by my staff, but by someone who testified before our committee, precisely as was advertised to me. That is actually more teachers killed than police in the line of duty. But it is shamefully close if it is not precisely accurate. But I say this mainly because I want the American people to understand what they intuitively know, and that is that places where we assumed there was safety, places where we assumed we would not have to worry, professions we assumed that would be able to be conducted without fear for physical safety, those assumptions are no longer accurate. And I know my friend from California knows all too well what happens in schoolyards with people wielding assault weapons, and what happens to teachers in inner city as well as in few occasions rural schools because of the availability of not only guns but the ethic of violence that permeates our society today. Now I see my friend from New Mexico is on the floor, and I would reserve the balance of my time and be delighted to yield to him.
Senator from Delaware.
I ask unanimous consent that further call the quorum be dispensed with.
Without objection, so ordered.
Madam President, I realize I have 12 minutes left, as I understand it, on my time. I would ask unanimous consent that I be granted such additional time as I will need to finish my statement, which I estimate will be somewhere between 12 and 20 minutes total time.
Without objection, so ordered.
Well, Madam President, we're finally here. If all goes as I assume it will, this will be the last statement on the crime bill before we move to final passage of this bill. Now, while I'm speaking, I'm going to ask my staff as I turn to give me a list of all the staff members who I should recognize on this effort, because at the outset, as the senator from Utah knows, the amount of work that the staffs have put in on this now roughly 900-page bill that covers over $22 billion of potential expenditures over the next 5 years has been absolutely awesome. And I think, I know he agrees, I think it's very important that the public understand that these professional people who work with us earn every penny that they get paid. And as a matter of fact, in the case of my staff and the senator from Utah's staff and the Judiciary Committee, the lawyers and professionals who work on our staff, in almost every instance, and I speak for myself, in every instance they all took pay cuts to come and take these jobs. This is not a situation where they're here because of the money. They have taken pay cuts to take the jobs. My chief counsel and others, these are people, these are women and men of great talent, and I think we should, I want to make sure before we finally vote on this that I pay particular tribute to them. Secondly, before I speak to the bill, I might point out that although if you read the Almanac of American Politics or any other document that characterizes the senators in terms of whether they're liberal, conservative, moderate, good, bad, or indifferent, you would find that if you're going to put people at opposite ends of the scale ideologically, you would find, I suspect, in most pundits' mind that the senator from Utah and the senator from Delaware might be at opposite ends of that scale. The truth of the matter is we are not, but also the truth of the matter is that one of the reasons why this democracy of ours works as well as it does is we resolve our difference collegially in this country and in this body. Were we in Bosnia, we might be at war. Over here, we don't go to war. We trust each other. We work with each other. We fight like the devil with each other on matters of principle, and we end up resolving our problems. I have found in my dealings with the senator from Utah that he is as good as his word, and he is a legislator. He wants to get things done. And so I am delighted that this bill has gone from being the Biden crime bill to the Biden-Hatch crime bill. It is good for the Senate, and I presumptuously will suggest it's good for the country that people like he and I, who have very different views on a number of things, can come together on something as consequential as this legislation. And I pointed out, only to reinforce the point I made after the senator from Texas spoke, we have finally crossed the divide, I think, in this country, in American politics, about the requirements that are necessary to deal with crime in America. This senator from Utah is one who feels as strongly about dealing with the root causes of crime as he does about dealing with those who perpetrate crime. As you heard the majority leader, the senator from Maine, saying that the days of the debate gone where all we talked about was the social conditions that cause crime and others only talked about the need to impose penalties. Hopefully, this passage of this bill will be the beginning of the end of that era of division in this country about having a consensus on how to deal with public safety problems in this country. Hopefully. And hopefully this will be the beginning of a second effort to begin to deal with how we keep young people from getting into the crime stream and into the drug stream. And so, quite bluntly, that's the part that excites me most about what we're about to do, that we have finally, hopefully, ended the acrimony. We will disagree. We will disagree, and we do disagree. As we say in this body, I associate myself with the remarks of my close friend, the majority leader, Senator Mitchell, when he pointed out, with a single exception of the death penalty that I happen to support, I agree with everything he had to say. I think the admissibility of evidence that we've passed here in this body is absolutely outrageous as one of the amendments. The notion that someone, after 800 years of developing evidentiary rules through our English jurisprudential system, and having done it because it works, and it works for one purpose, the rules of evidence have developed over these last 800 years in order to figure out how to best get at the truth and eliminate prejudicial material into a courtroom. Prejudicial material denies you the prospect of getting at the truth, or diminishes the prospect of getting at the truth. We here on the floor of the United States Senate blithely voted, overwhelmingly, I might add, to allow someone to walk into a courtroom in the midst of a trial for a particular crime and say, without ever having raised the issue before, it could be 2 years old, 20 years old, 50 years old, walk in and say, with the prosecutor, say, by the way, the defendant did that to me 10, 12, 15 years ago. And you'd be able to say, well, why didn't you say something 10, 12, 15 years? These are violent acts, violent crime. This is not harassment. These are violent crimes. Now, obviously, if you are in a jury box and you are listening to testimony from somebody saying, John Doe did such and such to me, and then they bring in a parade of people who never raised charges before, for which you've never been convicted, and no one in their right mind could suggest that's not prejudicial. It is an outrage that we would pass something like that. I'm chalking it off to the fact that people are busy here, that this is a 900-page bill, that 6,000 things are going on at the same time and no one had to focus on it. Because I would be dumbfounded, and I refuse to believe that a majority of this body actually consciously thought this through and consciously decided to rip apart 800 years of tradition as it relates to the rules of evidence. I would hope to the Lord that wasn't the case. I refuse to believe it. Also, we have in here yesterday, we just decided that we're better able to determine what the Eighth Amendment means in the Supreme Court of the United States of America when we did the prison cap amendment. I mean, think what we did. We fought for 15 years here about court stripping. And then in one fell swoop, with very little debate, we walk in here and a majority of senators vote to strip the Supreme Court of the United States of the right to determine whether the Eighth Amendment's been violated. Well, if that's true, let me point out, we can do that with the 14th Amendment, the First Amendment, the Second Amendment. The Fifth Amendment. We can just say, hey, by the way, Supreme Court, the way you've ruled on the 14th Amendment, we don't think is accurate, so you can't get to rule on it anymore. We think we know. It's preposterous. It passed, though. We also have in here a trend that disturbs me greatly that was added to the original Biden bill. All these things have been added to the underlying original Biden bill. And that is we federalize everything that walks, talks, or moves. I mean, my Lord, if it occurs, it must be a federal problem. If it occurs, we must federally deal with it. Well, you know, that's standing as a kid I went to grade school with. You say, you just stood that on its head, boy. We just stood on its head. The 200 and some year notion of federalism. You know, Montesquieu had a pretty good idea a long time ago, picked up by the Founding Fathers. The notion of a separated government so power could not be concentrated in any one branch to prevent abuse. It's called the notion of federalism. Now, maybe I'm too much a product of teaching a course on federalism in law school. Maybe I know too much about the issue. But it astounds me that we've decided to federalize everything. And the people who, in fact, argue most in the floor here to federalize crimes and punishments and alternatives are the people who in my first 15 years in the Senate were the states' rightsers. The people are saying, state of such and such cannot be, you know. Now they're here saying, let's federalize it, make it a federal crime. So much for states' rights. The other thing that disturbs me that was added to the original Biden bill by amendments, and I hope the House does not see it the same way, is I have heard speech after speech after speech on this floor, particularly after national governors' conferences are in town, from my Republican friends particularly, but also my Democratic friends, about no more mandates to the states. We're not going to mandate the states do anything anymore. Matter of fact, just before this crime bill was up, I don't know this for certain, but I'm willing to bet, if you go back and look at the congressional record the previous 3-4 weeks, you can probably find 20 speeches on federal mandates. No more federal mandates. Can't do that to the states. They're overburdened. And I might point out the governors and the mayors and the county executives define federal mandates not only as mandates that tell you you must do something and give you no money, but they define a federal mandate as a mandate that says you, in order to get any money, must spend more money than we're offering you. They count them both as federal mandates. Added to the Biden bill here, now the Biden-Hatch bill, added to the bill were these incredible number of federal mandates. The prison provision. Now, you know, there's one prison provision in here. You know, I'm the guy that 5 years ago wrote a bill that no one supported, Democrats or Republicans, that said we should build federal regional prisons. Now we're hearing on the floor this great breakthrough that we need federal regional prisons. Okay, great. So far, so good. But there's a little difference this time. They say to be able for a state to take advantage of putting a state prisoner in a federal regional prison, they have to have a sentencing law in their state that's the same as a sentencing law federally, which I'm wedded to. I, along with 3 or 4 other people, the folks who wrote that Sentencing Commission legislation, including the senator from South Carolina, the senator from Massachusetts. That's been what, 15 years, 10 years? I don't know how long ago now. Well, that's a great idea. But guess what? In order for those states to qualify to be able to send a state prisoner to that federal prison, which will be built if this passes and becomes law in probably 3 years before anyone is built, in order to be able to send them to that prison, for every dollar that we give them indirectly by spending on building that prison and maintaining it, they're going to have to spend $10 to get somebody to the prison. Because it may even be more. If it's the $3 billion, my staff, I have to spend $20. Well, that's if you count just the $3 billion, right? Because what it works now is, there's $3 billion for regional prisons, ostensibly to help the states. but they have to change their sentencing laws so that they serve 85% of their time. The net effect of the state sentencing law changes in order to do that requires them to double their prison population, which means they have to build enough prisons in their state to house twice as many criminals as they now house in order to get a chance to get some of their prisoners sent to a state prison. Let me translate it in pure dollars. The states will have to spend 11.8 billion dollars per year over the next 5 years in order to qualify to compete for $3 billion of federal money. I call that a mandate. If I'm governor and you walk into me as one of these folks walk into me as my executive assistant and say, Governor, boy, do I have good news for you. The Congress just passed a bill to help you. They're going to build federal regional prisons and you're going to be able to put state prisoners in there. I'm going to say, great, we've got such a budget crunch in our state. This is a big help. Oh, one little caveat, Governor. You got to spend $20 for every buck you send over. So, and I'll say, of course, as governor, great, I'm going to go down to the legislature now and tell them the good news. I'm going to tell them for us to compete for that $3 billion, we got to spend $11.8 billion nationwide per year. Per year. The $3 billion's for 5 years. The 11.8 is per year. So that's a federal mandate as far as I'm concerned. I'll make you bet if it becomes law, as it is now, none of the states take advantage of it. So the net effect will be we're not going to be helping the problem very much. But there are other provisions in it that really do help. The $3 billion for boot camps that states, we give the states the money. So the thing that I think we should do to follow up on the majority leader's comments, Senator Mitchell, is the thing that makes this bill so good is that it deals with something that does work. And that is we have an obligation federally, in my view, to deal with the crime problem under the principles of federalism that have existed over 200 years. And that is, it is totally consistent with the principles of federalism to say to the states, this is a national problem falling within your jurisdiction. We are going to send you help and let you implement it the way you think it best works. That's what we've done with the other provisions in here. For example, the major provisions of now the Biden-Hatch bill are we establish a violent crime trust fund. There's a reason for doing that. The senator from Utah and I have concluded a long time ago. We're not going to walk in this floor, ask people to vote for something in an authorization that we're not going to pay for. This should be truth in legislating, not just truth in sentencing. The truth in legislating is if we're going to say we're going to do all this, we got to put our money where our mouth is. That's the phenomenal contribution the chairman of the Appropriations Committee came up with, which was against his instinct. As he pointed out here on the floor, he wasn't anxious to set up a trust fund. I've been talking about a trust fund and dedicated, be more precise, dedicated monies to fight law enforcement, with the senator from Massachusetts and I being a few of the people on the floor 6 years ago, who when we came up with money for a drug program and came up with money for a crime program, we said, here's how we'll pay for it. We'll have a dedicated tax. I know none of us are supposed to say we're for taxes, but he and I were for taxes to fight crime, because we were tired of people coming on the floor, talking tough, passing tough bills, and then not coming up with the money for them. The senator from West Virginia sits behind the leader's chair here. He came up with a proposal that was one better than that. He set up a trust fund. I might add that John Hilley of the majority leader's staff was really the architect of that. Good idea. So the first thing this bill does, it's a different bill than any we've ever passed, because in the bill we say how we're going to pay for it with specificity. And it's not a negative to have the chairman of the Appropriations Committee, who some might suggest is one of the more powerful members of the United States Congress, signing on to that proposition. Actually, not only signing on, coming up with it. The second thing this bill does, and the reason why it's historic, in my view, is that it provides for 100,000 police officers. Now, the 100,000 police officers is not just giving the states money to hire 100,000 police officers. One of the things we want to do very bluntly, and it's consistent with the principles of federalism, is to use the carrot and the stick approach. And we say to the states, all right, we know one thing. Community policing is more effective than the alternative. That is not having community policing. So given a choice of having 100 police officers, either in squad cars and cruisers and or behind desks, and 100 police officers with 5 behind desks and 95 walking the street, everybody knows 5 behind desks, 95 walking the street has a greater impact on diminishing crime and increasing apprehension than having them in cruisers and behind the desk. We need police in cruisers, we need police behind the desk, but we need more police out on the beat, walking the street, interacting with the community. So what do we do here? It's not merely that we follow through on the President's request to provide 100,000 local police officers. I want to make it clear to the public. These police officers are not going to be wearing federal uniforms. These are going to be local police officers, hired under local rules, accountable to local political entities, accountable to local police departments. We're just providing the money, a part of the money. The states have to come up with the other part of the money. Because I've found in my years of experience here, when you tell somebody federal government's going to do it all, their sense of responsibility diminishes. If you tell them they got to put up 2%, 5%, 10%, 25%, it's amazing how it focuses their attention. When I used to be a county council person in Newcastle County in Delaware, we would, in 1970, people would come in and say, we have a new program to build this park or do that. And I or someone else would say, well, how much is it going to cost us? Oh, it's not going to cost us anything. That's federal money. Well, I kind of thought federal money was my mother's money as much as state money was my mother's money because she pays taxes in both circumstances. And so we find when we attach a requirement to participate, we find there's a greater degree of responsibility. And we do that. But a second thing this does, beyond giving the financial help, a state, in order to get the money to hire more police officers, has to adopt the notion of community policing. Now, a lot of states haven't done that. A lot of localities haven't. Because it's harder to have a community policing operation than it is to have a standard operation. Were I a police officer being put in harm's way the way all are, and I wouldn't take that job for all the rice in China, thank God there are women and men willing to do it. But were I a police officer, I'd rather ride around in a squad car in a tough neighborhood than walk around with my leather boots on and shoes on. You can't blame him. So, a lot of police departments don't have community policing because the political entities, the mayor, the county executive, the governors, whatever, they sometimes don't have enough political clout to get the police department to do what they want done. In this one, now the mayor is going to be able to go to the chief of police and say, hey, chief, you want some more police officers? The chief said, yeah, we need them. I'm going to say, okay, chief, you got to change the way we police. So I don't want to do that. Okay, no problem, chief. No money. But you want them? We got to have community policing. So this does, I believe there's a real multiplier effect, Madam President, in this. It's not merely the money we're sending. We are impacting on the changing of the philosophy of how to more effectively police our streets, our neighborhoods, and our communities. Now, another item in this legislation that I think is different. I mean, I don't hear this much anymore, but when I first introduced the crime bill, editorial writers and others, not just editorial writers, but others, that's the same old thing. More cops, more whatever. Well, no one's saying that now that I'm aware of. But to reinforce that, these are new ideas. We found out that one of the problems we had was, to state the obvious, is prison overcrowding. There's not a person in this body, whether they're visiting from out of town and observing this, whether they're watching it on television, whether the press covering it or our colleagues who are participating in it, who haven't seen a news report in the last 5-6 years in their own media market where there's a story about how violent criminals have been let out of jail because there's no space for them. These these are the people who are out recommitting the crimes, a vast majority of them. So we decided that it's time not only for us to get involved, but become cost effective. And we found out, Madam President, that the build and maintain boot camps is more effective and cheaper than to build and maintain prisons. And we found out that of 840,000, 850,000 people in state prison systems, 160,000 of them were first-time nonviolent offenders. Now, why should they be taking up space in a prison system requiring those folks to pay $30,000 a year to keep them there? Why not put them in a boot camp? Why not put them in a Quonset hut? Why not put them behind barbed wire instead of a wall that's 20 feet high and 3 feet thick and costs tens of thousands of dollars to build? These are people who are not a risk to the community, but they deserve to be punished. And so we provide $3 billion here to get those folks out of the prison system, creating up to 100,000 empty beds in the existing prison system in the state level, providing space for up to 100,000 violent criminals can now be put in those spaces. Now, I'm not suggesting there's anything that it took a rocket scientist to think of that. The fact of the matter is we hadn't done it before, though, and this is just plain old common sense. It's a lot cheaper, and it opens up over the next 5 years 100,000 beds behind bars, behind walls, behind gun turrets, behind guards to put violent people who are now walking the street. Now, there's the other $3 billion for prisons that I suggest at regional prisons. It'll be there if it passes. I am skeptical that the states will take advantage of that piece. Maybe they will. And by the way, this is money we give to the states to build state boot camps. I'm also going to speak to some of the other aspects of this in a moment, but let me go through another provision. There is a new idea here, new to the federal level, but not new in the states, called drug courts. The crime bill includes $1.2 billion to help first-time drug offenders sentenced to probation go straight. Here again, with this innovative program, we give nonviolent drug offenders a chance and a choice. We put them in treatment or we put them in prison. It's their choice. Offenders who choose treatment are watched and tested, and if they fall off the wagon, we raise the stakes. We put them in boot camps. Right now, 600,000 of them are walking around the streets, no supervision. Or we assign them to community service or community-based incarceration. If they flunk out of that program, and they flunk out by being tested on a weekly basis, if they test positive, if they either don't show up for the test, and or they come and they test positive, then we put them in a prison. And when we put them in these prisons, what we do is we put them in drug treatment. We give the states the alternative to use drug treatment. I mean, you know, when I said this 6 years ago, everybody thought it was nuts. I noticed today in the press, I think I'm correct as I was shaving this morning, watching local television here, that there was a raid where they arrested a number of guards at Lorton Prison. And they arrested a number of people involved with prisoners in Lorton Prison. I remember I said to Ted Koppel 4 or 5 years ago, where he called me and asked, because he heard me say that there's more drugs in prison than outside of prison. And a lot of the press understandably thought that was just a flat old typical political exaggeration. That's what the press usually thinks, and lots of times they're right. This time they weren't right. So they did a program on Nightline from Lorton Prison. They got all these folks in a room, all these hardened criminals. The room was packed. And Ted Koppel asked the question almost apologetically, like, I know this is kind of crazy. I'm paraphrasing. I'm characterizing. And he might suggest mischaracterizing. He said, by the way, I mean, you get any drugs in prison? And all these guys in that prison said, yeah, we get drugs. Well, guess what? The D.C. police just arrested today an entire network of people for bribery and conspiracy for taking drugs into prisons. They're as plentiful in prisons as they are in the street. And so if we don't get drug treatment for those people in prisons, notwithstanding the fact they come out of after serving their time, they're no less dangerous to y'all. They come out still addicted to drugs. And they shoot you, maim you, rob you, burglarize your home. It's just back in the cycle again. So in these drug court programs, we give these folks treatment, first-time offenders. We don't spend tens of millions of dollars housing them in maximum security facilities. And we provide actual probation officers who follow them. There's actual supervision. We also have in here a major breakthrough, the assault weapons ban. The crime bill this year also, I believe, has a chance of keeping this ban. And I commend Senators Feinstein, DeConcini, and Metzenbaum for shepherding this through. I hope we can keep it in conference. I plan on doing everything in my power to keep it in conference. Also, we have the anti-gang provisions, $100 million program to prevent juvenile gangs from drug trafficking. There are far too many kids these days, gangs and drugs, that provide attractive alternatives to poverty, broken homes, and peer pressure. These grant programs to states for gangs in the bill will help catch these kids before they get into the gangs. I'll not take the time now to go into it, but one of the things we found out from massive number of hours of studies in the Judiciary Committee and hearings, that when you have a boys, I've said this before on the floor, if you have a public housing project, same profile of people, two different projects with the same profile. You put a boys club and a girls club in one and you don't have one in the other. The rate of crime and the rate of drug abuse is significantly lower in the place where the boys club is, where the girls club is. Again, no rocket scientist, just what your mom and your grandmom used to talk to you about. An idle mind is a devil's workshop. An idle child living in a project with nothing else to do is a lot more inclined to get into trouble and drugs than a child that's in an organized program in their environment, no matter how deprived their environment is. We provide for the ability to do that here in this bill. The thing that I care most about in all of this bill, Madam President, and I know the presiding officer feels as strongly as I do, is the violence against women's legislation. I've worked almost 5 years on that legislation. Nothing comes easy in this place. And we finally passed it with the great help and co-sponsorship of the senator from Utah. I consider it the proudest accomplishment, self-serving thing to say, but the proudest accomplishment of my career in the United States Senate, bringing this to the point where it's on the verge of being able to become law. And I want to take this opportunity to thank Senators Hatch and Dole for working with me on this legislation, as well as for the 66 other co-sponsors, including the presiding officer, which is now part of the Omnibus Crime Bill. I might note parenthetically, I was disappointed that the House of Representatives last night essentially emasculated the bill. The committee, I should say, in my view, emasculated the bill, taking out the single most important provision of the bill. But I can assure you that with every ounce of energy I have in me when we get to conference on this bill, that this is a non-negotiable item as far as I am concerned. Because the fact of the matter is, violence against women is epidemic in America. The numbers are staggering. A woman is battered in this country every 18 seconds. In recent years, the number of women abused by their husbands was greater than the number of women who got married. Maybe there's a correlation there. Some 22 to 35% of all the women who visit emergency rooms after 22 to 35, depending on which study you take, minimum 22, max 35, of all the women who visit an emergency room are there because of violence. And 1 million women a year must receive medical treatment because of injuries due to violent attacks. In passing the Violence Against Women Act, we'll take an important step toward ending the cycle of terror and violence which marks the lives of so many American women. The act has three basic goals: to make streets and homes safer for women, to make the criminal justice system more responsive to the victim of these crimes without having to change the rules of evidence to do so, and three, to extend to women victims the equal protection of our nation's laws. I know this body is tired of hearing me talk about this. I've become a broken record on it. But the reason why we need federal legislation in this area is because the states have such a disparate and inequitable body of laws regarding women. For example, in my state of Delaware, if you are a significant other, meaning if you've gone out voluntarily with the man before, even if he rapes you, he cannot be convicted of first-degree rape. You can get him for second-degree rape, but not first-degree rape. The underlying premise that rationalizes that position is sickening. But for every one of those examples I can give you in my state, relatively speaking, is advanced compared to the vast majority of the states in the nation. So we need the federal government. This legislation is the first comprehensive approach to fighting all forms of violence against women, committing a broad array of needed reforms. New laws that focus on offenders' conduct rather than on the victim's character. By the way, I don't care whether a woman is loose or prudish. I don't care whether she is good or bad. I don't care whether she is a mother or a saint or a sinner. No man has a right under any circumstances other than in self-defense to ever lay a hand on a woman. Period. No right. Seems to be part of our ethic. I might add, no right to lay a hand on anyone else. But our ethic seems to be, if it's a woman, somehow she's a chattel. She's somehow property. How many times have you heard the expression, my woman? Who the hell, what do you mean, my woman? But that's part of the ethic. Part of the ethic is that somehow it's okay. I cite this again. I was dumbfounded to find out the origin of the phrase rule of thumb. I held a hearing, I don't know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago now, and one of the witnesses said, Senator, do you know what the origin of the phrase rule of thumb is? And this person held up their thumb. I said, no. They said back, I believe, and I'll correct the record if I have my dates off, but I believe it was the 13th or 14th century in England when a woman was viewed as a chattel, that is, owned as a piece of property that wasn't real estate, like a table or a light fixture. That's a chattel. A woman was the chattel of her husband. And so what happened was that the woman, the husband, was able to use whatever force necessary, quote unquote, with his chattel. Chattel was his wife and his children. So he could beat them and do whatever he wanted. But they had a funny thing happen. A lot of women were dying. So they decided they had to do something about this, the first quarter reform movement in about the year, 1380 or something. And so what the English courts and the common law decided? They set out a rule called the rule of thumb. It said that you can beat your wife with a stick and be exonerated as long as the rod or stick you used was not bigger than the circumference of your thumb. I imagine a lot of women walked around checking their potential husband's hands before they agreed to marry. But think of that. That's where the phrase comes from. Well, we got to change the ethic. I believe this violence against women's legislation is the most significant thing, and I think most people who've looked at it will acknowledge the most significant thing to begin to change our attitude about violence in women, what's appropriate, what's inappropriate. There are many other provisions in this bill that I think warrant being pointed out, that are different, that are new, like the ones I've mentioned, that are innovative. Again, when I say innovative, I'm not trying to claim credit for having this great, incredible insight into the problems. I'm not suggesting that they're innovative in the same sense that finding a cure for cancer is innovative. They're all common sense. But they're innovative in the sense they have not been tried before. They have not been done before. They have not been offered before. And one of those is, Madam President, I think until we start to pay attention to the rights of victims in our society, victims in the criminal justice system, that we are going to continue down the road of a disrespect for the law. Think about it for a minute. What happened to us not many years ago, matter of fact, back in our English jurisprudential history and the beginning of the colonies in this country, the way it used to work was the victim played a central role in the prosecution of a defendant. The way it used to work was, if you assaulted me, Madam President, what I would do is I would go find a constable and I would hire that constable. I'd actually pay them to go arrest you. And then I would pay the cost of taking you to trial before a judge. And before a judge, if you were convicted, I had to pay the cost of putting you in prison. But I was a central piece of that whole process, the victim. And what happened was we found out it wasn't very equitable. And I'm oversimplifying this in the interest of time, but the essence of this is accurate. And so what happened was they came along and they said, hey, wait a minute, only wealthy people get to do that, redress the grievances against them. So they said what we're going to do is from now on, it used to be, by the way, it would read, if it was a criminal case, it would be Biden versus Murray, as opposed to the state of Washington versus Murray, or the state of Delaware versus Biden. It was the name of the victim versus the defendant. But at least the victim had an opportunity in that system to go through the psychological vetting, if you will, of the harm done to them. You know, when you beat someone up, when you violate them or their property, it has a similar effect to them if they have any other tragedy that happens in their life. I mean, we discount that. And now one of these people in Washington, D.C. who are here watching this debate, if they are mugged, they don't get a chance to determine whether or not when the trial will occur. They don't get a chance to determine whether or not a plea bargain should be offered to that person. They don't get a chance to be any part of the process. And they're lucky if they get a phone call in any major city in America to say what happened to the defendant. They may get a phone call and say, you know that person who beat you up, broke your arm, put you in the hospital? Well, we didn't think we had enough evidence against them, so we're not going to pursue the case. That's what happens. No wonder people are callous and angry. So what happened, Madam President, is as we changed it in the name of providing more equity, we took the victim out of the process. And now it's the state of Delaware versus Jones instead of Biden versus Jones. There is no psychic satisfaction that is necessary for the healing process of a victim, nor is there financial remuneration. In this bill, we do both. We re-inject the victim as part of the process, so that if the person is convicted, they can, in fact, get, as part of the penalty, a requirement or an opportunity for the judge to say, you must pay back. You must provide restitution to the person you've done a wrong to. What do we teach our children? We teach our children when they do something wrong, it's not sufficient to suffer the consequences. We take them back to the teacher and we make them apologize, right? We take them back to the store owner and say, I stole the candy bar. We make them do things, and those processes developed over 1,000 years for a simple reason. It is part of the healing process for the victim. Well, we don't do that now. In this legislation, we begin to do it again. We have in here a bill that I worked very hard with Oprah Winfrey on. Oprah Winfrey is a woman truly dedicated to dealing with the abuse against children. This is not some phony showbiz, I got my cause routine with her. I've worked with her for too long. I know that part of her too well. And so she came up with an idea to prove that not all these ideas come from me or my staff or others who are professionals. She said, can't we do something about the fact that we have child molesters working in areas where, in fact, children reside. It's like that old sick saying applied to this. When they asked Willie Sutton, why do you rob banks? He said, that's where the money is. Well, the vast majority of people who take care of children are not child molesters at all. But if you are a child molester, your inclination is to go where the children are. And so in this legislation, we set up a national criminal background check system for those who care and provide for the children, the elderly, and the disabled. So that now you running if I'm running a child care center, I want that protection. I want to know whether I'm going to hire John Jones. I want to be able to check his background. And I don't want to hire John Jones if John Jones has been convicted of child molestation or whatever. This provides the opportunity to find that out. We also put $1 billion more in for more FBI agents and prosecutors. And one of the most important provisions of this bill that's been added is Senator Cole's provision relating to children and guns. It prohibits and punishes people for the sale or transfer of a gun to a juvenile. There's $250 million in here. I had a lesser amount, and thanks to the senator from Utah, we have bumped it up for rural crime. You know, 1-, 2-, and 3-person police officers, and I know the state of the presiding officer relatively well. Once you get across the Snoqualmie Pass, you get into pretty small towns and communities with 1-, 2-, and 3-person police departments. They're faced with the same complicated problems that cities are. We provide help for rural communities in this bill. And there's also, I put in this bill, $100 million for safe school programs to fund crime and safety measures and to develop in-school anti-crime and anti-drug and anti-gang programs. But they can do anything with this money at the local school level, from put in a metal detector to hire a guard to put in a drug treatment program. Again, not rocket science, but important. Now, let me conclude by suggesting that there's a lot in this bill that no one's paid much attention to, and understandably, I'm not being critical when I say that. And I'm going to submit this for the record when I conclude, and I title it the Biden bill, and now it will be the Biden-Hatch bill. The Biden-Hatch bill, Beyond Crime and Punishment. And to sum it all up, it goes like this. Of this almost $23 billion we're going to spend, close to $5 billion of it goes for treatment, prevention, and programs to keep children and people from crime. This is not just cops and robbers stuff. This is very important stuff along the lines the senator from New Mexico spoke about this morning, the senator from Connecticut, Senator Dodd, spoke about last week, the senator from Missouri, Senator Danforth, spoke about and will speak about again, and so on. What most of my colleagues don't even realize, and I understand it because they have other things to do, and because when I introduced the Biden bill of 500 pages, they did not have a chance to look at it all. What happens in there, and let's talk about the community policing and prevention programs. We have in here almost $9 billion to hire new cops. You've heard me talk about that. But of that, 15%, or $1.2 billion, can be used by the cities. Instead of hiring a cop, they can engage in innovative prevention programs such as early intervention teams of police, social workers, educators, doctors, working together to intervene early in the lives of juveniles, like the program they have at Yale, up at New Haven, at Yale. We provide money for them to do that. We also have proactive prevention programs. You're allowed to use this money to set up police athletic leagues, big brother and big sister programs, boys clubs and girls clubs. They can use up to $1.2 billion of the money to do those things. And I might add, I want to thank Craig Washington, a leader, an incredibly articulate congressman from the state of Texas, a black American, an African American who's a leading member of the Black Caucus in the House of Representatives, for helping me focus on this. We also have alternatives to incarceration. In the boot camps, as I said, we authorized $3 billion to states to operate these boot camps. But the boot camps, while they're in the boot camps, the states can use this money for aftercare services such as job training, education, drug treatment, halfway houses, job placement programs, and self-help and peer programs. Of that $3 billion, this is not just more cops and robbers. The drug court program, they're allowed to use up to of the $1.2 billion. They can use it for community service programs, which employ offenders with nonprofit and community organizations. These are first-time offenders. And community organizations, community-based incarceration, like halfway houses, weekend incarceration, electronic monitoring, and drug programs within the boot camps. Also provide for aftercare services with that $1.2 billion for education and job training and self-help and peer programs. In addition, we have $100 million in here for gangs, but also for juvenile justice gang prevention. We allow the states and the school districts to keep their schools open. That's what the senator from New Mexico wants to do. Well, we've already done that in the bill. I welcome doing more of it, but it's already in the underlying bill. So now, instead of closing, it seems kind of silly to close a school in an inner city at 3:30 or 5 o'clock. Why don't you keep it open all summer? Not with the teachers having the responsibility. They have enough. If the community wants to use those facilities for after-school programs, for recreational programs, for example, there's a program, I believe it's in Trenton, New Jersey, or maybe it is in Newark, New Jersey, Senator Bradley told me about, which they'd be allowed to use the money for. What they do in very difficult neighborhoods with high crime rates, they set up, using the schools, they set up programs after school where they have year-long team competition. They divide the neighborhood into all these teams. It's not just basketball teams. It's like a decathlon. They get so many points for the basketball season, the baseball season, and guess what else they get points for? They get points for having the grade point averages in there. So every kid on this team brings to their team their report card, as well as how many points they can score. And guess what happens? It's working. Kids take pride. They want to win. And so now, when the kid's going to flunk out of school and he's on the team, the rest of the kids say, hey man, you're going to cost us, Jack. It works. Well, they'll be able to do this with this juvenile justice portion. We have pre- and post-trial drug abuse treatment for juvenile offenders, treatment of drug-dependent kids. And the violence against women legislation, I might add, goes a long way for prevention. It requires rape education on college campuses and schools. It also provides battered women's shelters, National Family Violence Hotline with Senator Kennedy's idea, youth education, $400,000 is provided for programs to educate youth and families about violence and abuse. And Safe Colleges, $20 million is targeted to rape and violence prevention and education on college campuses. In the Safe Schools program, $100 million can be used for drug and alcohol education, counseling programs for children who are victims of abuse and crime, programs that provide alternative constructive programs for youth at risk for gang recruitment. And I will not take any more time in the Senate, but let me conclude this portion by saying, and I ask unanimous consent that this be placed in the record as if read at this point.
Without objection, it will be placed in the record.
This, Mr. President, is a solid piece of legislation. And I say to all those who are concerned about us not doing enough to deal with the causes of violence, that we spend and allow the states to spend $4.2 billion to deal with the innovative approaches I've just spoken about. In addition, they will have available to them $18 billion to deal with actual law enforcement measures, more police, more prisons, etc. So, Mr. President, let me again thank everyone for their cooperation, and I might conclude by thanking particularly the Majority Leader. I thank him because occasionally I have gotten him in a little bit of hot water. I hope he doesn't get offended by what I'm about to say. he has indicated to me for the last 4 years that although he wants to know what's going on, he has never once attempted to overrule and/or interfere with anything substantively I've done in this crime legislation. As a matter of fact, he probably has second-guessed himself whether or not he should have given me the carte blanche he has given me to negotiate and/or write the legislation. I hope it hasn't gotten him in too much trouble, although occasionally I know it has. But I want to thank him for his confidence, for his cooperation, and for his leadership, because we would not be at this point, and we're all saying these kinds of things. It sounds like a mutual admiration society, but as they say, I speak the truth on this point. We would not be at this point were it not for his great skill in moving us through this morass. We would still be debating the first part of this legislation, and hopefully he's coming to the floor because he might have a breakthrough further on how we're going to enter into a time agreement on other parts of the bill. But I want to thank him, thank my colleagues, and I yield the floor.
Mr. President.